Welcome back, everybody, to episode 5 on our series about the most consequential battles in history. Today, we're going to talk about a battle that was very important, and we're going to see why. I'm talking about Tours, the battle that decided Europe's fate. Now, we always start with a question, and the question is, what if the future religion of Europe, its language, its laws, even its calendar turned on a single autumn day in a forested valley? No grand empire fell here, no ancient capital burned, no emperor died on the field. And yet, what happened near the town of Tours in 732, or Poitiers, as it's called in some traditions, since the battlefield lay in the midway between the two cities, may have quietly decided whether Western Europe would grow under the cross of Christianity or the crescent of Islam. Even the exact date is debated among historians, with some sources suggested October 733 or even earlier estimates like 725. A reminder of how scarce and uncertain records are from this period. Though, as we'll discuss, calling it Dark Age is deeply misleading because we are in the middle of the Dark Ages, the medieval times or Middle Ages. For a century, a new force had swept across the old Roman world faster than Rome ever had itself. From the deserts of Arabia, across the palaces of Persia, from the pyramids of Egypt, across the sands of North Africa, and across the sea into the hills of Spain. It defeated emperors, it toppled kingdoms, it moved with terrifying speed. And now, for the first time, it pushed north into the heart of Europe. What army stood in its way? Not an empire, and not even a king, but a warlord with a misleading title, Mayor of the Palace. Don't let that fool you. By 732, mayor meant nothing like city administrator. It was the man who held the real power while puppet kings performed ceremonies. The man who commanded armies, seized church lands and crushed rivals. The de facto ruler of the Frankish kingdoms. His name was Charles. They would call him the Hammer. Charles Martel. This is the story of Tours and why the battle mattered, even if no one at the time fully understood it, and its legend grew much larger in later centuries. As we unpack this, ask yourself, how do small moments shape the faith and fate of continents, and how do we turn them into myths? Before we dive into the Islamic conquest and Charles Martel's response, we need to address two persistent questions. What exactly were the Middle Ages, and why do we call them that? And what about this idea of Dark Ages? The Middle Ages, also called medieval period, from the Latin medium aevum, literally Middle Age, conventionally spanned from around 500 years after the birth of Christ to 1500. This roughly 1,000 years of European history. The starting point is usually pegged to the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476. The last Roman emperor in the West, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the Germanic leader Odoacer. Though some historians prefer 410, when Alaric sacked Rome, or even 395, when Emperor Theodosius divided the empire between his two sons. 476 is the traditional marker. The Western Empire, which had ruled Europe for centuries, was gone. The ending is even more debated. Some historians use 1453, when the Ottoman Turks captured Constantinople, ending the Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire. Others prefer 1492, when Columbus reached the Americas, or when Granada, the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, fell. Still others use 1517, at the start of the Protestant Reformation. There is no single agreed upon date because change didn't happen uniformly across Europe. So why Middle Ages? Here's a crucial point. The term Middle Ages wasn't invented by people living in that period. They didn't even think of themselves as medieval or living in the middle of a period. When medieval writers referred to their own times, they called it modern. Nova in Latin, meaning new. The term was invented centuries later by 15th century Renaissance scholars, particularly Italian humanist Petrarch in the 1330s, or Petrarca. These scholars looked back at the centuries between the fall of Rome and their own time and saw them as a gap, a middle period between two golden ages, the classical civilization of Greece and Rome and their own supposed rebirth or renaissance of that classical culture. So Middle Ages literally means the age in the middle, sandwiched between classical antiquity and the modern world. It tells us more about how Renaissance scholars viewed history than about the period itself. But Petrarch didn't just call this period middle, he called it dark. He and later Renaissance humanists dismissed roughly 1,000 years of history as culturally inferior, just like a mere gap between the brilliance of classical antiquity and their own supposed enlightenment. They saw it as an age when the achievements of Greece and Rome were forgotten, when ignorance and superstition were rampant. But modern historians have thoroughly debunked this myth. The Middle Ages, particularly from the 8th centuries onward, were a time of extraordinary innovation and cultural achievement across multiple domains. So when we talk about the Battle of Tours happening in the Dark Ages, understand that we're referring to a period where written records are scarcer than in Roman times or the Renaissance, not a civilization in decline. So both the Islamic world and Christian Europe in 732 were dynamic, creative, advancing civilizations. This wasn't a clash between enlightenment and darkness. It was a clash between two vibrant cultures, each with their own achievements, each convinced of their divine mandate. With that context in mind, let's meet the forces that will clash at Tours. To understand Tours, we need to rewind a century to the birth of a movement that reshaped the world. And let's clarify the protagonists. As Professor Alessandro Barbero reminds us in his lectures on medieval Europe, who were the Arabs and Franks clashing here? The Arabs weren't a sudden unknown horde like the Huns or Mongols. Pre-Islam Arabs lived on the empire's margins, some integrated as Roman citizens, even producing an emperor like Philip the Arab, who ruled from 244 to 249. His coin portraits show distinct ethnic features that set him apart from typical Roman emperors. Arab units served in Roman armies, terrifying enemies with their ferocity. Ammianus Marcellinus, a Roman historian writing in the 4th century, describes a vivid incident near Constantinople in 378. During a battle against the Goths, the Saracens, the Roman term for Arab, their cavalry drank the blood of fallen Gothic warriors to instill fear, turning barbarians to flight. Even though Ammianus wrote over a century after Philip's reign, his accounts preserved earlier Roman experiences with Arab warriors, painting them as fierce, almost supernatural fighters on the empire's desert frontiers. Civilized Arabs converted to Christianity and attended councils like Nicaea in 325, participating in the great theological debates that shaped earlier Christianity. Meanwhile, Bedouins, the desert nomads, remained outside of the Roman Empire and practiced polytheistic religions in which Allah was often regarded as a supreme deity. The name Allah shares a common Semitic root with the Hebrew Elohim, showing shared linguistic and cultural roots across the ancient Near East. Everything changed. The Prophet Muhammad fled persecution in Mecca to Medina in an event called the Hijra, or migration. This journey marks year 1 in the Islamic calendar and the start of a new era for his followers. Within a decade, Muhammad and his community unified much of Arabia under Islam, a monotheistic faith emphasizing submission to one God, that is, Allah. Daily prayer, charity, fasting during Ramadan, and pilgrimage to Mecca. What followed was one of the most extraordinary expansions in human history. Muslim armies burst from the Arabian Peninsula with a potent mix of religious zeal, political unity, and military prowess that no one could have predicted. By 650, the world map had been redrawn. The Eastern Roman or Byzantine Empire lost Syria after devastating defeats. Above all, the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. A large Byzantine army was routed in the scorching Syrian desert. Some accounts speak of a sandstorm that blinded the defenders and favored the Muslim forces, though historians still debate this detail, with many Arabic sources crediting Khalid ibn al-Walid's tactics instead. The Sassanid Persian Empire, Rome's ancient rival for 6th century, collapsed entirely between 633 and 651. Its Zoroastrian faith was overtaken by Islam, and within a generation, one of the world's greatest empires vanished. Egypt fell between 639 and 642. The Nile's rich lands, which had fed Rome and then Constantinople for centuries, were now lost, plunging the Byzantine Empire into chronic grain shortages and hardship. Jerusalem, holy to Jews, Christians, and newly to Muslims, surrendered peacefully to Caliph Umar in 637. Patriarch Sophronius handed over the city keys himself, beginning centuries of Islamic rule over Christianity's holiest sites. North Africa followed soon after. Indigenous Berber tribes from Egypt to the Atlantic responded with a mix of fierce resistance and alliance. Many converted or joined to the newcomers, seeing opportunity in the new order, while others fought stubbornly against it. This wasn't a single planned invasion, it was a civilizational surge driven by faith, unity, and opportunity. But why so successful? First, timing. The Byzantine and Persian empires had exhausted each other through decades of brutal warfare. The last great Byzantine-Caesarian conflict left both sides drained, with borders vulnerable, armies depleted, and populations were tired by war. When unified Muslim forces arrived from Arabia, they faced demoralized and overstretched defenders with little recovery time. Well, second, governance and local appeal. Many subjects, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, were alienated by heavy taxes, religious persecutions, and doctrinal strife under Byzantine or Persian rule. Muslim conquerors offered zimmi, protected status. There was non-Muslims could keep their faith, property, and communities in exchange for the jizya tax and loyalty. For many, this meant lighter overall burdens and greater religious freedom than before, leading some communities to welcome or at least accept the change of rulers. And number three, military innovation. Early Islamic armies excelled in mobility, using camel cavalry to cross deserts swiftly and outmaneuver foes where horses struggled. They showed strong discipline, high motivation, and adaptability, quickly incorporating captured technology, including Persian siege engines and other Byzantine Persian equipment, to besiege fortified cities effectively. As Hugh Kennedy notes in his book, The Great Arab Conquest, the Arabs succeeded because they combined religious motivation with military innovation, exploiting the weaknesses of exhausted superpowers. It was a perfect storm of factors that allowed a relatively small population from Arabian deserts to challenge and defeat the greatest empires of the age. By 711, under the Umayyad Caliphate, an Arab dynasty ruling from Damascus, forces led by Tariq ibn Ziyad crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Visigothic Spain. The very name Gibraltar comes from Jabal Tariq, meaning Tariq's mountain, commemorating this invasion. Within 7 years, the Visigothic kingdom, Christian inheritor of Roman tradition but fatally divided, ceased to exist. Europe barely noticed at first, preoccupied with its own internal strife and power struggles. But Spain's fall opened the door to Gaul, modern France. Umayyad governors like Al-Sam in 721 launched raids north, testing Frankish defenses. There were probes for loot, for slaves, to weaken borders, but they exposed Europe's vulnerability in a way that should have alarmed its rulers. When a new power rises with such devastating speed, how does the old world respond? For Europe, Tours would provide the answer. The Visigoths who ruled Spain in 711 weren't the mighty Rome of old. They descended from the victors of Adrianople in 378, that catastrophic Roman defeat we covered in episode 4. They had settled after the sack of Rome in 410, blending Germanic warrior traditions with Roman law and Christianity. For 3 centuries, they built a kingdom in the Iberian Peninsula. But by 711, their kingdom was fragile, riddled with internal divisions. The nobility feuded viciously over royal succession, turning what should have been an orderly transfer of power into civil wars. The Jewish population faced severe persecutions as kings forced conversions to attempt religious unity. Slaves and the poor rebelled periodically amid growing economic troubles. The kingdom was a powder keg waiting for a spark. At the Guadalete River in July 711, King Roderick's army met the Muslim forces under Tariq ibn Ziyad. What happened next was catastrophic. Internal betrayal, nobles deserting or switching sides mid-battle, combined with poor tactics, led to a complete surrender. Roderick was killed in the fight. Though sources disagree on exactly how he died. Some say he drowned fleeing across the river, others that he fell in combat. What's certain is that centralized Visigothic rule collapsed in a single day. As the Mozarabic Chronicle, an 8th century text written by Christian Spaniards living under Muslim rule, they say with devastating simplicity, the kingdom fell in a day. This phrase captures both the speed and the shock of the conquest. Within a few years, Al-Andalus, Islamic Iberia, was established as a vibrant society blending Arab, Berber, and Visigothic elements. Advanced agriculture arrived via irrigation systems from the east, bringing new crops like rice, oranges, and sugarcane. There was relative tolerance for people of the book. Jews and Christians were allowed to practice their faiths in exchange for paying the jizya tax. This convivencia, Spanish for coexistence, produced remarkable cultural achievements. Scholars like Averroes, a 12th century philosopher, would reconcile Aristotle's ancient Greek thought with Islamic theology, creating works that profoundly influenced both the Islamic world and Christian Europe. But we must remember this golden age was built on conquest. But Islamic expansion didn't stop at the Pyrenees mountain. Umayyad governors saw the wealth and weakness of Gaul to the north. They launched raids into Aquitaine, the wealthy southwestern region of modern France. By 732, Muslim forces had sacked Bordeaux, one of Gaul's richest cities. These weren't full-scale conquests yet, but they were razzias, they were raids for tribute, slaves, and prestige, testing northern defenses. Churches were looted, like the sack of St. Hilary's Abbey in Poitiers in 721. Monasteries burned. To Muslim warriors, these weren't just military targets. They were symbols of Christian polytheism, places dedicated to saints that seemed to dilute pure monotheism, proof that Christians had deviated from the one true God. Gaul looked dangerously exposed. The Frankish kingdoms were divided under the Merovingian dynasty, kings who by the 8th century had become mere figureheads, do-nothing kings whose real power had been usurped by palace officials called mayors. No standing army existed. Forces were levied seasonally from nobles and freemen who owed military service. Post-Roman Europe was a patchwork of competing authorities. From Professor Barbera's insights, we know that mutual stereotypes colored both sides' perceptions. Arabs viewed Franks as large, sluggish barbarians shaped by cold northern climates, physically strong but coarse-mannered and stupid, speaking what seemed like 25 different confused languages. They saw themselves as the civilized power facing uncouth warriors. Franks, on the opposite side, viewed Arabs as perfidious and nefarious, a terrible plague, as Bede, a 8th century English scholar chronicling events from afar, described them. These views were inherited from centuries of Roman-Arab interactions, where Saracens had been portrayed as fierce but untrustworthy desert raiders. The clash at Tours would be framed by both sides as civilization versus barbarism, each convinced they represented the civilized world defending against savages. And here enter Charles Martel, the Hammer. His nickname meant crusher of enemies, perhaps echoing the biblical Judah Maccabee, whose name also meant hammer in Hebrew, and who had a successful rebellion against the Seleucid Empire. Or perhaps it was more literal, as Frankish chroniclers described. Just as the hammer crushes and breaks iron and steel, so he crushed and broke all his enemies in battle. Charles wasn't a crowned king or an emperor. His official title was Mayor of the Palace, in Latin Major Domus, meaning superior of the house or household manager. To modern ears, mayor sounds like a city administrator or bureaucrat. Nothing could be further from the truth. Originally, under strong Merovingian kings in the 6th century, the mayor of the palace genuinely was the king's chief household official, managing royal estates, coordinating the court, serving as the king's right hand. Think of a combination of chief of staff, treasurer, and prime minister. But by the 8th century, everything had changed. The Merovingian dynasty, descendants of Clovis, who had unified the Franks in the 5th century, had declined into ceremonial irrelevance. The Merovingian kings were called rois fainéants, do-nothing kings, who performed rituals, attended ceremonies, but wielded no actual power. They were just puppets. The real power belonged to the mayors. They controlled the treasury, dispensed patronage, commanded the armies, made alliances, and declared wars. They were, in every meaningful sense, the rulers of the Frankish kingdoms, king in all but name. Charles Martel himself recognized this. He styled himself not just Major Domus, but Princeps et Dux Francorum, Prince and Duke of the Franks. And from 737 to his death in 741, he didn't even bother appointing a Merovingian puppet king. The throne sat empty. Charles ruled alone as the de facto monarch. His son, Pepin the Short, would eventually formalize what everyone already knew, deposing the last Merovingian in 751 and crowning himself king, founding the Carolingian dynasty. His grandson, Charlemagne, who will be the crowned Holy Roman Emperor. So when we say mayor, understand we're talking about a military strongman, a warlord who had clawed his way to absolute power. A better modern comparison might be the shoguns of Japan, officially serving under an emperor but actually running everything. Charles Martel forged a new military model for the Franks. He created a warrior elite bound to him through land grants called beneficia, an earlier form of feudalism where military service earned fiefs, creating a professional corps of fighters, loyal to him personally rather than to abstract concepts like kingdom or crown. To fund the system, he did something shocking. He stripped church properties of their lands. Monasteries and bishoprics that had accumulated vast estates over centuries suddenly found their wealth confiscated and redistributed to Charles's warriors. This wasn't an anti-clerical spite, it was pure necessity. The church had become the largest landowner in France, and Charles needed those resources to build his army. He compensated bishops with protection and promises of future restoration, and many churchmen grudgingly accepted the arrangement as preferable to Muslim conquest. His army consisted primarily of disciplined heavy infantry, warriors armored in mail coats, using large shields and long spears in dense, almost phalanx-like formations. Unlike many contemporary armies that emphasize cavalry, Franks traditionally fought on foot, valuing stability and cohesion over mobility. This would prove crucial at Tours. The Franks weren't an ancient tribe with centuries of recorded history. Rather, they essentially invented themselves during the great migrations of the 4th and 5th century. Different Germanic groups banding together for mutual strength, their very name meant free or brave in their Germanic language, a self-assertion of identity. They converted to Christianity under Clovis in 496. Legend says this happened after a crucial victory at the Battle of Tolbiac, where Clovis vowed to convert if the Christian God granted him victory. Whether legend or history, the Franks came to see themselves as God's chosen people. The prologue to the Salic Law, written in the 740s, captures this extraordinary self-confidence. The illustrious people of the Franks, founded by God, stronger in arms, faithful in alliances, profound in decisions, noble in body, beautiful in appearance, audacious, swift, strong, converted to the Catholic faith, immune from heresy. Long live Christ who loves the Franks. As you can see, they were very much self-appointed. The force crossing the Pyrenees in 732 was led by Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiqi, governor of Al-Andalus under Caliph Hisham, a seasoned Yemenite commander experienced in crushing Berber revolts in Africa. He was no reckless raider, but a strategic leader from a culture that viewed Franks as barbaric inferiors, large and strong, but sluggish from cold climates, speaking confusing languages. His expedition consisted of veteran troops, Arab heavy cavalry in mail armor, Berber light infantry, possibly tens of thousands strong. Chronicles vary wildly on numbers. Modern estimates suggest 20,000 to 30,000 fighters. Their motive was complex: loot and prestige, certainly, testing Frankish weakness from potential future conquest, but not necessarily a full invasion. The Umayyads were stretched thin from India to Spain, facing internal strains like Berber unrest and succession disputes. They advanced along the Garonne and Loire river valleys, the natural invasion routes into Gaul. They sacked Bordeaux, defeating Duke Odo at the Garonne River. Their target? The Abbey of Tours, rich in relics of Saint Martin, patron saint of the Franks. This wasn't just about wealth, it was symbolic. The abbey represented Frankish Christian power, and to Muslims, Christian veneration of saints seemed like polytheism, a delusion of true monotheism. Charles Martel mobilized his forces, marching south with an army likely comparable in size, perhaps 20 to 30,000 Levite warriors and his personal retainers. He chose his ground carefully, selecting terrain near the towns of Poitiers and Tours. The area featured forested hills that would favor his infantry over Muslim cavalry. The October weather, growing cold, would advantage his armored Frankish warriors over lighter-equipped southern troops. October 732. The exact date is debated, somewhere between October 10 and October 25th. The two armies faced each other for several days before the battle, neither side rushing to engage. This was typical of medieval warfare. Commanders scouted, maneuvered for advantage, waited for the right moment. Charles held high ground on wooded terrain. The cold autumn weather favored his armored Franks. The trees limited the effectiveness of cavalry charges, forcing the Muslims to fight on ground that negated their mobility advantage. The Franks formed their traditional shield wall, a dense line of warriors with large shields overlapping. Spears braced forward. They stood in tight formation, immovable. The Muslim charged repeatedly, like cavalry probed for weaknesses. Heavy lancers smashed against the line, trying to break through. Their charges failed. The Franks held. An 8th-century Spanish Christian chronicler, writing from Al-Andalus, described the Franks as standing like a wall of ice, emphasizing their persistence against southern foes. This is one of the few colorful descriptions we have of the battle, and it captures the fundamental dynamic mobile cavalry unable to break stationary, disciplined infantry. Then came the turning point. A rumor spread through the Muslim camp that Frankish forces were raiding their baggage train. Whether this was true, a deliberate Frankish tactic, or simply panic, we don't know. But it caused chaos. Soldiers broke formation to protect their plunder. The treasure looted from churches and cities across Aquitaine. Abd al-Rahman rallied his men, trying to restore order. In the confusion, he fell, killed in combat, though exactly how is unclear. With their commander dead and discipline broken, the Muslim army withdrew during the night. They didn't flee in disorder, but conducted an organized retreat, taking their wounded and much of their loot. Charles did not pursue. Wouldn't you chase a retreating enemy? Charles was cautious. He didn't know if this was a real retreat or a tactical ploy to draw him into an ambush. Medieval commanders who pursued too aggressively often found themselves in disaster, so he held his ground, securing the battlefield. His men looted the abandoned Muslim camp, finding treasures from sacked churches across southern Gaul, a symbolic reclamation. Charles had hammered the infidels. The chroniclers would remember this. Tours wasn't the largest battle of the era, it wasn't the bloodiest. It didn't destroy Al-Andalus or end Islamic expansion. Medieval sources actually downplayed it. Frankish chroniclers summarized the battle in a few lines, often confusing it with other battles like Toulouse or Narbonne. To medieval minds, God governed history, not men, so individual battles mattered less than divine providence. But Tours halted northern momentum. It was the first major Muslim defeat in Western Europe. Infantry had beaten cavalry. Expansion paused. The Umayyad soon faced the Berber revolt in 740 and were overthrown by the Abbasid dynasty in 750. Their attention turned eastward toward Baghdad and beyond. Islam continued to thrive in Spain. The Caliphate of Cordoba would be established in 929, becoming one of Europe's most sophisticated civilizations. But Europe north of the Pyrenees remained Christian. This enabled the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, the spread of monasticism, the preservation of classical learning. Had Tours been lost, deeper Muslim incursions into Gaul were possible, potentially altering the religious and cultural map of Europe. To understand Tours' significance, contrast it with the Battle of Yarmouk in 636. At Yarmouk, Muslim forces under the brilliant general Khalid ibn al-Walid defeated a massive Byzantine army in the scorching Syrian desert. Some accounts mention a sandstorm aiding the Muslims, though this remains debated. Byzantine decisions and exhaustion from recent war with Persia contributed to the defeat. Yarmouk's consequences were catastrophic for Byzantium. They lost the Levant and Egypt, accelerating Islamic expansion across the Mediterranean. Yarmouk opened entire worlds to Islam. Tours closed one avenue of expansion. Islam came to dominate the Mediterranean southern and eastern shores. Europe developed separately in the north and west. These separate trajectories would shape the Crusades, the Renaissance, and the modern world. As Hugh Kennedy reflects, Yarmouk created the Islamic heartlands. Tours preserved Christian Europe's core. Medieval Europe emerged as a distinct Latin Christian civilization. Pope Gregory the Great had spoken of Europe as a cultural entity, the Christian West distinct from the Byzantine East and the Islamic South. Charlemagne would be crowned Father of Europe, Rex Pater Europa, in recognition of this emerging identity. But what if Charles Martel had lost at Tours? He had no reserve forces. Gaul was fragmented and divided. Islam might not have conquered all of Europe. Geography, logistics, and internal Umayyad problems would have prevented that. But southern France would plausibly have become an extension of Al-Andalus. No Charlemagne rising from the Carolingian dynasty, a different Holy Roman Empire, or none at all. A radically different Middle Ages. 19th century writers inflated Tours into a clash of civilization. Edward Creasy included this in his 15 Decisive Battles of the World. Edward Gibbon speculated that without Tours, the interpretation of the Quran would now be taught in the School of Oxford. Voltaire echoed the same sentiment. Even Adolf Hitler, contrarian as ever, supposedly expressed regret that Islam didn't conquer Europe, seeing it as more martial and less soft than Christianity. Modern historians are more measured. Tours was a raid that was stopped, not an invasion turned back, but it gave Europe time to consolidate under Christianity, time for Carolingian Renaissance, time for monasteries to preserve classical learning that will fuel later European development. In closing, Tours was not about domination, it was about survival. A battle where no empire fell, but a future was preserved. A warlord with the misleading title of mayor faced an army that had conquered from India to Spain. He chose his ground carefully, he held the line. And when the dust settled, Christian Europe had bought himself time to become itself. The hammer had fallen, Europe would be Christian. Next time, we will explore another clash that shaped a nation, the Battle of Hastings in 1066, where an arrow or perhaps a cavalry charge decided whether England would be Anglo-Saxon or Norman. I will see you there and thank you for following up. Bye.